real salaries, inflation-adjusted salaries, average salaries in the defense industry have gone down since the 80s, something like 20%, which is extremely remarkable because the industry is getting more white-collar, but for some reason the salaries are going down.
The piece that you put out a couple of months back now about unions in the defense industry and how they have been really remarkably decimated over the past, few decades. Can you talk to us about that?
Absolutely. I'm really happy to get to talk about this piece. You can find it on Inkstick Media. I think it's called Union Rates Decline at Top Defense Contractors. So I got a few tips with this piece. Really, let me first go back. The motivation to do this reporting was kind of hearing in general that defense contractors are highly unionized. And I thought, really, I don't know. I speak with workers in these places, and I get the impression that's not the case. And after sort of reporting out the story, finding the data, speaking with the individual workers, my conclusion is that impression was once true, but it's just several decades out of date and hasn't really been updated. So I got a tip that in an SEC filing that publicly traded companies have to file called a Form 10K, they often will report their union figures in a rough way. It will say something like, we have a workforce of 100,000 people and 19,000 of them are represented by collective bargaining unions. So I gathered all of that data for the top 5 defense contractors, and I had a really nice breakthrough, which was I wanted to know historical figures. But it's only, those forms you can find online pretty easily through maybe 2000 or so. But I wanted to go back even further than that. And I got access to a very specialized archive of corporate documents that allowed me to dig back even further to see what that data was like. And so, for example, at Lockheed Martin, which is the largest defense contractor in the U.S. and in the world, 69% of workers at least were unionized in 1971. Wow. And nowadays that number is just 19%. And that's still, quote, high for the defense industry, because at Northrop Grumman, the company that I just mentioned, just 4% of workers are unionized. That figure blew me away. Because these are manufacturers. These are supposed to be the kind of workplaces that lend themselves to organizing. And in a variety of ways that we document in the piece, they really have both stealthily and sometimes not so stealthily bust their unions over time.
Right. And what are some of the ways that they have that they've been able to get away from union membership?
Yeah. So one that workers and labor figures would tell me about, of course, was subcontracting. So really just getting people off their books, which was the workers at the Lockheed Martin plant in Marietta, a suburb of Atlanta, told me that was one way that the company had been just stealthily chipping away at their membership for year after year. And then it has it becomes sort of a vicious cycle downward, because then the union is just in defensive mode, trying to convince the remaining members that it's still worth it to participate. They showed me their union hall that they said used to have, 3,000 people or more, and that their union elections back in the 70s would be a 3-day affair. And nowadays they say on a good, an average month, they have maybe 25 people show up to their meetings. So subcontracting was a big one. Another force is sort of the white collarization of the defense industry. This is also a figure you can find in the company's Form 10Ks. They'll report their number of engineers, their number of scientists, and you can track over time. I have the figure in my piece, but I'd have to pull it back up. But, that number was maybe in the teens or 20s or so back in the 70s. And now that number is sort of over 50%. And even, of course, there exists at least one large white-collar union at a major defense contractor at Boeing in Washington State. But in general, union activity at defense contractors is a blue-collar affair. So sort of the white-collarization in general of the workforce has also pushed those numbers down. And finally, what they are doing in a very major way, which is moving into right-to-work states, including and very particularly here in the South. And in Utah, which I also just mentioned.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
And so, the decline of unionization, were you able to track in your piece? I can't remember any discernible correlations. I know that, it's not like a rigorous kind of peer-reviewed study. And so there's not, it'd be difficult to say definitively that there's a cause. But were you able to track any correlation in workplace incidents or, compensation, healthcare, retirement packages, anything like that with the decline of unionization in these companies?
Yeah, well, at least with compensation, it's actually quite remarkable that there is data on compensation in the defense industry that comes from an industry group called the National Defense Industrial Association, and they show it's about that real salaries, inflation adjusted salaries, average salaries in the defense industry have gone down since the 80s, something like 20%, which is extremely remarkable because it's the industry is getting more white collar, but for some reason the salaries are going down.
And is that 20% adjusted for inflation, or is that actually
just adjusted for inflation?
Okay,
which is really remarkable.
Yeah.
Which kind of gets back to how I wanted to introduce the story, which is I think our understandings of employment in the defense industry are kind of a little bit stuck in the past and just need some updating, because indeed, I mean, I've heard this from workers, I've read this in the literature. In a time like the 60s, 70s, and 80s, this was a highly unionized, this was a really good job to have. And I think the contractors have kept up that sort of good job creation rhetoric without having much accountability or scrutiny for the way that it just isn't the job it used to be, back in the day. And I should add, I mean, there are still, some members who are making good salaries and who are making good livings inside the industry. I spoke with some workers at the Lockheed plant in Marietta, who described to me the very livable pensions they will have when they retire in a few years. But guess what? The company cut the pensions back in like 2011 or something. So they know the new hires just aren't going to have the life that they had. So I sort of think it's important to draw out the way that a job at a defense contractor, especially for new entrants, just really isn't what it used to be. The union in Marietta have told me that their turnover is enormous, and they're just constantly onboarding people, which then, of course, in the process also weakens the union to have, your young people and your new entrants, leaving for a job at Delta Airlines as soon as it comes up.
Right. And so the way that you ended your piece about the defense industry unions is, interestingly, especially with the UAW being in the conversation so much, a lot of the UAW conversation is about a just transition. And in that context, we're talking about transitioning from gas-powered automobiles to electric-powered automobiles. But you mentioned that there's, interest in the defense unions in a just transition from a, war production, producing hypersonic missiles that may or may not ever be used. And then honestly, if they're ever used, it'd probably be, detrimental to the human race, like just not good for people to use these things. And so, there's some interest in some of these defense unions in, saying like, hey, look, maybe our labor should be doing something that's like useful instead, and making a more green economy.
Absolutely. And sort of just to detail that, the largest union by far amongst defense contractors is the Machinist Union. They told me that of their membership of about 600,000, about 60,000 at their last sort of survey were in defense. And that can include many jobs are in some way like a hybrid job. So for example, if you're working at Pratt & Whitney, you're making engines both for the military and for commercial use. Whereas, if you're, certain jobs, if you're at the F-35 plant, you're pretty much in an exclusively military job. But yeah, the machinists themselves have recognized that they need to and already are diversifying their membership as the face of, a union worker changes in America. So they told me they were going into everything from legal aid nonprofits to libraries to healthcare workers. And I put this in our newsletter I think it was just last week. They now have their what I believe is their first campaign at an electric vehicle plant in Illinois. So yeah, it's remarkable. And that sort of gets to what I've heard when I've spoken with defense workers and when I've spoken with, union leadership is that, people they care about their job and they care about what they're doing at the end of the day and what the product will be used for. But most immediately, they care about having a good job. And when Lockheed Martin, cuts your pensions, and when you're, doing backbreaking labor, and when you're working 12-hour shifts and you are, asphyxiated by argon gas, like at a certain point, there's more questions about what is a good job. So I feel like when I've spoken with workers, many may say, yes, I would like to have hypersonic missiles for XYZ reason. And I like hearing that and I want to hear why. But also what I hear so much in the foreground and so saliently is really, I want to have a good job. I want to support my family. I don't want to retire in poverty.
Right.
And I think that's, I think that hopefully both of our stories start to tell the story of what that looks like.
Yep, absolutely. So Taylor, really appreciate your time. Is there anything else that you think, you'd want to leave us with before we let you go?
Thank you very much for having me on. And I'm thrilled to come on to Huntsville and basically send me any tips. I'm all ears always for labor stories. That's exactly how I heard about the deaths of the workers at Northrop Grumman. So I'm T Barnes, TBARNES at inkstickmedia.com. And we have a newsletter that I'm very grateful has gotten pretty popular called Military Industrial America on Substack. So also if you just want something in newsletter like, hey, Taylor, please highlight my organizing campaign. Please highlight what happened at my job site. Send it to us and we'll put it in our newsletter.
Awesome. Great. We'll keep that in mind. Taylor, thanks for coming on again. Appreciate it.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.